In the history of how nations die, the collapse is usually announced by cannon fire, marching boots, or cities reduced to rubble. But in the 19th century, one of the greatest empires on earth was dismantled without an invading army. There were no victorious parades, no foreign flags raised over palaces. Instead, the Ottoman Empire was conquered quietly by balance sheets and interest schedules. It was not destroyed by gunpowder, but by compound interest. This is the story of the first modern debt trap, a model so effective that it would be repeated across the world for the next 2 centuries. It proves a brutal geopolitical truth. You do not need to invade a country to control it. You only need to own its debt. In the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still appeared formidable. It stretched from the Balkans deep into Europe, across Anatolia, down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and across North Africa. From Istanbul, the Sultan ruled over millions and commanded the crossroads of global trade. On maps, it was still a superpower, but beneath the ceremonial splendor, the empire was economically decaying. While Britain and France were industrializing, building factories, railways, and steam-powered economies, the Ottoman system remained largely agrarian. Peasants and artisans were forced to compete in a world increasingly dominated by machines. The state's finances reflected this backwardness. Tax collection was inefficient and corrupt, relying on intermediaries who siphoned off revenue before it ever reached the capital. Cash shortages were constant. For centuries, Ottoman rulers had solved fiscal crises with medieval tools, debasing the currency, confiscating elite wealth, or delaying payments. But the modern global economy had changed the rules. These tricks no longer worked. The empire needed capital to survive. It needed a modern army to deter Russia, infrastructure to govern vast territories, and the appearance of a civilized European power to maintain diplomatic relevance. For decades, Ottoman rulers resisted borrowing from Western banks. There was a cultural and religious aversion to usury and a political fear of dependence on Christian powers. That resistance collapsed in 1853 when Russia invaded Ottoman territory, igniting the Crimean War. The conflict was enormous, expensive, and existential. Britain and France intervened militarily to stop Russian expansion, but they also brought something more dangerous than soldiers. They brought bankers. The war drained the Ottoman treasury at a terrifying pace. Soldiers needed wages, weapons needed to be produced, ships needed to be supplied. Sultan Abdülmecid, I faced a choice between financial taboo and imperial collapse. In 1854, the empire signed its first foreign loan with a syndicate of British and French banks. It was presented as Allied assistance. In reality, it was the first shackle of financial captivity. The loan terms were predatory. The bonds were issued at a deep discount. For every 100 units of debt the Sultan signed, the empire received only about 80 in cash. The banks kept the difference as commission and risk, yet interest was charged on the full amount. The Ottomans were paying interest on money they never received. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance: high effective interest, reduced cash flow, and long-term obligations that grew faster than state revenue. At first, the results felt miraculous. The army was paid, the crisis eased, Russia was defeated, the empire survived, and the Sultan learned a dangerous lesson. With a signature in London or Paris, gold could appear instantly. When the war ended in 1856, the borrowing did not. The Ottoman elite had tasted easy credit and became addicted. They looked at Europe's glittering capitals and felt inferior. They wanted Istanbul to rival Paris and London. They wanted to prove the empire was modern. But instead of investing in productive capacity, factories, education, irrigation, they spent on prestige. The most infamous symbol of this vanity was the Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdülmecid abandoned the traditional Topkapi Palace, considering it outdated and insufficiently European. He ordered a new palace on the Bosphorus that would rival Versailles. Dolmabahce was an architectural masterpiece, filled with gold leaf, imported marble, crystal staircases, and the largest chandelier in the world. It was breathtaking. It was also a financial tombstone. The palace was built entirely with borrowed money. Its cost equaled roughly a quarter of the empire's annual tax revenue. While Anatolian peasants struggled with wooden plows, the state imported luxury from Europe it could not afford. To fund this extravagance, the empire returned repeatedly to Western banks. Each loan came with worse terms. Each issue increased dependence. By the 1860s, Ottoman finances resembled a Ponzi scheme. New loans were required simply to service old ones. Debt payments exploded. In 1860, about 15% of state revenue went to debt service. By 1870, it exceeded 50%. Half of all taxes collected from farmers, fishermen, and merchants were immediately transferred abroad to bondholders in London and Paris. The state was being hollowed out from within. When cash shortages hit between major loans, the government turned to local financiers in Istanbul, borrowing short-term at extreme interest rates. This only accelerated the collapse. The empire was no longer governing. It was servicing debt. The transformation was complete. What looked like a sovereign. By the early 1870s, the Ottoman Empire was no longer merely indebted. It was structurally trapped. Debt was no longer a temporary instrument to survive crisis. It had become the operating system of the state. The empire did not borrow to grow. It borrowed to exist. Each new loan was not investment, but oxygen, and every breath made the dependency deeper. More than half of all state revenue now vanished abroad before it could fund an army, build a road, or educate a child. The empire still looked alive, but its organs were failing. To keep the machine running between major European loans, the government increasingly relied on the Galata bankers, a network of local financiers based in Istanbul. These lenders provided short-term advances at catastrophic interest rates, sometimes exceeding 20%. These were not development loans. They were emergency cash infusions used to pay salaries, appease unrest, or bridge gaps until the next foreign bond issue arrived. It was financial suicide disguised as survival. Each loan solved today's problem by multiplying tomorrow's catastrophe. When Sultan Abdulaziz ascended the throne, the pattern intensified. Abdulaziz was obsessed with power and prestige, particularly military power. He believed a modern navy would restore Ottoman authority and deter European contempt. So he ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards and advanced artillery from Germany. On paper, the Ottoman navy became one of the largest in the world. In reality, it was a fleet of floating debt. There was no money to fuel the ships, no coal to operate them, no maintenance budget to keep them seaworthy. Many never left harbor. They rusted in the Golden Horn, monuments to borrowed ambition. The illusion collapsed in 1873. A financial panic erupted in Vienna and spread across Europe, triggering a global downturn known as the Long Depression. Capital markets froze. European banks, suddenly short of liquidity, stopped lending. The music stopped. At the same moment, disaster struck the Ottoman heartland. Severe drought hit Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. Crops failed, livestock died, famine spread. The peasantry, which formed the tax base of the empire, had nothing left to give. Tax collectors returned with empty ledgers and horror stories. Revenue collapsed just as debt payments came due. By the summer of 1875, the situation was terminal. The treasury was empty. A massive interest payment to European bondholders loomed in October. Attempts to raise a new loan failed. The markets were closed. The empire faced an impossible choice: starve its population to pay foreign creditors or stop paying. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued the Decree of Ramadan. It announced that debt payments would be cut in half. 50% would be paid in cash. The remainder would be paid in paper promises. In diplomatic language, it was a moratorium. In financial reality, it was a default. The reaction in Europe was explosive. Ottoman bonds were widely held by middle-class investors in Britain and France. Teachers, clerks, shopkeepers, people who had been told these bonds were safe and profitable, saw their savings collapse. Newspapers erupted with rage. The Ottomans were denounced as thieves and barbarians. Political sympathy evaporated overnight. Financial default translated instantly into diplomatic isolation. This weakness invited aggression. In 1877, Russia seized the moment. Seeing the empire bankrupt, diplomatically isolated, and militarily strained, it declared war. The Russo-Turkish War was catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers fought bravely, but they were unpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized. The Russian army advanced deep into Ottoman territory, reaching the outskirts of Istanbul itself. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, surrendering large portions of the Balkans and Caucasus. Worse still was the financial clause. Russia imposed a massive war indemnity, demanding hundreds of millions in compensation. Now the empire faced an impossible arithmetic. It had defaulted on Western debt, lost territory, and now owed a crushing sum to Russia. The total debt burden exceeded the productive capacity of the entire economy. Insolvency was absolute. Sultan Abdulhamid II inherited a corpse. He ruled a state that had lost credit, land, and independence. But instead of carving up the empire militarily, the European powers chose a more efficient method. They would conquer it financially. Territorial occupation was expensive and politically risky. Financial control was cleaner, profitable, sustainable. In 1881, representatives of European bondholders arrived in Istanbul. They were not diplomats or generals. They were bankers. They carried contracts, not weapons. The negotiations produced the Decree of Muharrem, a document that formally ended Ottoman financial sovereignty. It created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the OPDA. This institution was unprecedented. It was not an Ottoman agency. It was not a foreign government. It was a corporation governed by representatives of British, French, German, Italian, and Austrian banks. Its mission was simple: extract revenue. Under the decree, the empire surrendered direct control over its most valuable taxes. Revenue from salt, tobacco, silk, fishing, spirits, and stamp duties was transferred to the OPDA. The Sultan no longer collected these taxes. The bankers did. The OPDA built its own bureaucracy, hired thousands of armed tax collectors, and operated independently of Ottoman authority. It was a state within a state. From that moment on, sovereignty became fiction. The Sultan still wore the crown. But the empire's lifeblood flowed directly into European vaults. The debt trap was complete. The conquest had succeeded without firing a single shot. From the moment the Ottoman Public Debt Administration took control, the empire ceased to function as a sovereign economic entity. Power no longer flowed from the palace or the parliament. It flowed from accounting offices staffed by foreign clerks. The OPDA was ruthless, efficient, and permanent. Unlike the old Ottoman bureaucracy, plagued by corruption and inefficiency, this new system operated with modern European discipline. Warehouses were built, records were standardized, collections were enforced, and the results were immediate. The revenue streams under OPDA control stabilized and grew, but none of that wealth belonged to the Ottoman people. It was extracted and exported. By the late 19th century, roughly 1/3 of all Ottoman state revenue was being siphoned off by the OPDA every year. 1 out of every 3 coins produced by the empire never reached the government. It went straight to creditors in London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. The Ottoman state was left to govern a vast, diverse empire with what remained. That meant chronic shortages, no money for schools, no money for domestic industry, no money for meaningful infrastructure. Modernization became impossible because every surplus was preemptively confiscated by debt service. The empire was trapped in permanent underdevelopment by design. The system did more than drain money. It drained sovereignty. The Sultan could not pursue independent policy without creditor approval. Any major project required permission from the OPDA. Roads, ports, railways, even military expenditures were constrained by debt obligations. The empire still existed, but it no longer controlled its future. It was administered, managed, overseen. The conquest was complete, and it was invisible to the average citizen. Yet geopolitics does not tolerate vacuums. While Britain and France were satisfied extracting cash, another power saw opportunity: Germany. Unlike its rivals, Germany arrived late to the imperial game. It had few colonies and limited access to global markets, but it had industry, ambition, and a strategy. German leaders looked at the Ottoman Empire and saw not just a debtor, but a strategic partner. A bridge between Europe and the Middle East, a counterweight to British dominance. The German Kaiser personally courted the Sultan. He framed Britain and France as parasites, bleeding the empire dry. Germany, he claimed, wanted partnership, not exploitation. And then came the proposal that changed everything: the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, a steel artery connecting Central Europe to the Persian Gulf, bypassing British-controlled sea routes and the Suez Canal. For the Ottomans, it was irresistible. A railway promised troop mobility, economic integration, and modernization. It offered hope of escaping the debt trap by creating real economic capacity. But hope came with chains. The Ottoman treasury was empty and controlled by the OPDA. Britain and France would not finance a project that threatened their strategic interests. Germany stepped in. Deutsche Bank offered the financing. But the terms were predatory in their own way. The contracts guaranteed to German companies profits per kilometer of track, regardless of usage. If traffic was low, the Ottoman state paid the difference. Worse still, the agreements granted German interests rights to minerals and oil discovered along the railway corridor. Economic sovereignty was not restored, it was transferred. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had effectively shifted from Anglo-French financial dominance to German economic dependency. German officers reorganized the army. German engineers ran the railways. German banks held the new debt. Britain and France watched with growing alarm. What had begun as a financial arrangement was now a strategic threat. The debt of the sick man had become a trigger for global rivalry. When World War I erupted in 1914, Ottoman leaders faced a final gamble. They understood the truth. As long as the debt existed, as long as the OPDA controlled revenue, the empire would never be free. They made a desperate calculation. If Germany won the war, Ottoman debts to Britain and France could be erased. The OPDA could be dismantled. Financial sovereignty could be restored. It was an all-or-nothing bet. The moment the Ottomans entered the war, one of their first acts was symbolic and defiant. They expelled British and French officials from the OPDA headquarters in Istanbul. Debt payments were halted. For the first time in decades, the empire felt a surge of autonomy. But the freedom was an illusion. The war was disastrous. The empire was torn apart by invasion, rebellion, famine, and genocide. When the war ended, the Ottoman state no longer existed. But the debt survived. When the Turkish Republic emerged under Mustafa Kemal, after a brutal war of independence, the European powers returned, not with armies, but with ledgers. At Lausanne, they demanded repayment. Their argument was simple. You inherited the land, you inherit the mortgage. The new republic could not afford isolation. It needed trade, recognition, and stability. It accepted the obligation. The debt was restructured, but not erased. For decades, the young Turkish state sent money abroad to pay for loans taken by long-dead sultans. The final payment on Ottoman debt was made in The collapse of the Ottoman Empire is often explained through wars, revolts, and ethnic fragmentation. But those were symptoms, not the cause. The real fatal blow was delivered long before the first shots of World War I were fired. It was delivered quietly, through contracts signed in foreign languages, through interest schedules that never slept, and through institutions designed to extract value without responsibility. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman state no longer collapsed because it was weak. It collapsed because it had been structurally engineered to fail. Once the debt system was entrenched, there was no peaceful escape. Any attempt at reform required money. Any attempt at resistance triggered retaliation in the form of blocked credit, diplomatic pressure, or financial isolation. The empire could not grow because growth would have benefited creditors, not citizens. It could not industrialize because surplus capital was already pre-allocated to debt service. It could not modernize its army without borrowing more, deepening dependence. Debt was not a problem the Ottomans faced. Debt was the environment in which they existed. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration remained one of the most efficient revenue collection systems in the empire. Ironically, it worked far better than the Ottoman state itself. European accountants succeeded where Ottoman reformers failed, but this efficiency had a single purpose: extraction. The OPDA was not designed to develop the empire. It was designed to guarantee payment. The fact that it improved salt production or silk output was incidental. The benefits flowed outward. The costs remained inside. This arrangement shaped everything. Education lagged. Industrialization stalled. Infrastructure was fragmented and foreign-controlled. When unrest grew in the Balkans or Arabia, the state lacked the resources to respond effectively. When nationalism spread, the empire could not offer prosperity as an alternative. The debt trap had stripped the state of its most important tool, the ability to invest in its own future. Sovereignty without solvency proved meaningless. The final gamble, aligning with Germany in World War I, was not ideological. It was financial. Ottoman leaders understood that only a radical rupture could break the debt regime. Victory offered cancellation. Defeat offered destruction. They chose the gamble because slow death was already guaranteed. When the gamble failed, the empire disintegrated. But the financial logic of conquest did not disappear with it. The creation of the Turkish Republic did not erase the past. The new state inherited not only ruined infrastructure and exhausted people, but also obligations written decades earlier in European capitals. Despite fierce resistance, the Republic accepted the debt settlement to regain access to global markets. Independence required payment. Sovereignty required compliance. For 30 years, a nation born from revolution sent scarce resources abroad to settle accounts it never approved. This is the enduring legacy of the Ottoman debt trap. It did not merely destroy an empire. It created a template, a model of control without occupation, influence without administration, extraction without responsibility. It demonstrated that in the modern world, power does not always arrive with armies. Sometimes it arrives with loans. This lesson would be repeated across the 20th century in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. Different flags, different languages, same mechanism. Debt replaces conquest, interest replaces invasion. Financial supervision replaces colonial governors. And the result is the same: policy constrained, development delayed, sovereignty conditional. The Ottomans believed they were borrowing to modernize. In reality, they were borrowing away their future. They believed prestige could substitute productivity, that appearance could replace capacity, that Europe's wealth could be imported without cost. They were wrong. Money is never neutral. It always comes with power attached. Empires do not always fall in flames. Some fade in silence. The Ottoman Empire did not die screaming. It was slowly foreclosed, and the warning it leaves behind is as relevant now as it was in 1854. Sovereignty is not a flag. It is not a speech. It is not history. Sovereignty is balance sheets. Sovereignty is who controls your revenue. Sovereignty is whether your surplus belongs to your people or to your creditors. If you do not control your debt controls you. And that is the final truth buried in the ledgers of a fallen empire.